Moscow, October 1956. The concert hall is silent in that particular Soviet way, the kind of silence that comes not from reverence, but from uncertainty, from fear of what comes next. Then the trumpet begins. It's a single note at first, clear and bright, cutting through the air like a knife through velvet. The sound swells, impossibly free, impossibly American. The musician on stage, a black man in a sharp suit, sweat already forming on his brow, lifts the horn higher. The rhythm section kicks in, piano, bass, drums. The music explodes into the hall like a dam breaking, like color flooding into a black and white world. The audience doesn't know what to do. For decades, this music has been forbidden, denounced as the degenerate sound of capitalism, the chaos of the West. But here it is, performed with official approval, sanctioned by the very government that once banned it. Students lean forward in their seats. Factory workers tap their feet despite themselves. Even the KGB agents stationed at the exits find their shoulders swaying, just slightly, to the irresistible pulse. This is jazz. This is America. And for the next 2 hours, it will shake the foundations of the Soviet Union more effectively than any missile, any speech, any propaganda campaign ever could. What they don't know, what nobody in that hall could possibly guess, is that this music is no accident. It is America's most unlikely weapon. And the story of how it got here begins not in Moscow, but in Washington, in the desperate, paranoid years after World War II, when two superpowers faced each other across an ideological chasm and realized that winning the future would require more than armies. It would require winning hearts. The year is 1947. The Iron Curtain has descended across Europe. Churchill has named it. Stalin has sealed it. The world splits in two, east and west, communist and capitalist, red and free. But this is not a war fought only on battlefields. This is something new, something stranger. A Cold War where the real combat happens in newspapers, in radio broadcasts, in the minds and opinions of millions. In Washington, officials gather in smoke-filled rooms and face an uncomfortable truth. The Soviet Union is winning the propaganda war. Moscow paints America as a racist, imperialist empire where workers are exploited and minorities oppressed. And the damning thing, the thing that makes American diplomats sweat through their shirts, is that much of it is true. Across Asia, Africa, and Latin America, newly independent nations watch and judge. They see American wealth and power. They also see segregation, lynch mobs, Jim Crow laws that turn American democracy into a cruel joke for millions of its own citizens. The Soviets exploit every contradiction, every hypocrisy, every photograph of a whites-only sign. The State Department realizes something essential. In this new kind of war, image matters as much as bombs. Maybe more, because while nuclear weapons keep the enemy at bay, it's culture that wins allies. It's art that changes minds. It's the story nations tell about themselves that determines who the world believes, who they trust, who they want to be. But how do you sell American freedom to a world that can see American inequality? How do you prove your system is better when your own house is divided? The answer, improbably, impossibly, comes from the very community America has most oppressed. It comes from jazz. The idea emerges slowly at first, tentatively, from a handful of forward-thinking diplomats who understand that America's greatest cultural export isn't Hollywood or Coca-Cola. It's the music born in New Orleans, raised in Harlem, perfected in Chicago and Kansas City, the sound that grew from suffering and transcended it, that turned oppression into art and pain into beauty. Jazz is authentically American in a way nothing else can claim. It's innovative, dynamic, free-form, improvisational, all the things America says it is. And crucially, heartbreakingly, it's created by Black Americans, the very people whose mistreatment undermines American credibility abroad. Someone in the State Department has a thought so cynical and so brilliant that it takes everyone's breath away. What if we sent them overseas? What if we made them ambassadors? The paradox is staggering. A segregated nation sending Black musicians to represent it. Artists who can't eat in the same restaurants as white citizens, becoming the face of American freedom. Men and women who face daily humiliation at home, being asked to smile and play and tell the world that America is the land of opportunity. But the State Department knows what it's doing, because jazz is undeniable. When Dizzy Gillespie's trumpet hits those high notes, when Duke Ellington's orchestra swings into rhythm, when Louis Armstrong's gravelly voice wraps around a melody that's not propaganda, that's transcendence, that's proof that something beautiful and free can emerge from even the darkest soil. In 1955, the Jazz Ambassadors Program officially begins. The State Department doesn't call it a weapon. They call it cultural diplomacy. They call it goodwill tours. They call it building bridges. But everyone knows what it really is. It's a gamble that music can do what missiles cannot. That rhythm can reach places ideology never will. That 4/4 time might be the most powerful weapon in America's arsenal. The first ambassador is Dizzy Gillespie. Dizzy, with his bent trumpet and his puffed cheeks, his beret tilted at an impossible angle. Dizzy, who can make his horns sound like laughter, like crying, like revolution. The State Department approaches him carefully. They know his reputation, brilliant, unpredictable, fiercely independent. He accepts, but on his own terms. He'll play American music, sure, but it'll be his version, his rhythm, his truth. Then comes Louis Armstrong, Satchmo, the gravelly voice, the handkerchief, the smile that lit up stages from New Orleans to New York. Armstrong is already famous, a household name, the kind of artist who transcends genre and nation. When the State Department asks him to tour, they're not just asking for a musician, they're asking for an icon. Duke Ellington follows, the composer, the genius, the man who turned jazz into high art without ever losing its soul. Ellington, who wrote suites and symphonies, who made orchestras swing like small combos, and small combos sound like orchestras. Ellington, whose sophistication and grace made him palatable to white audiences, while his music remained defiantly, beautifully black. These men are not politicians. They are artists. But in the strange algebra of the Cold War, they become soldiers. Not with guns, but with horns. Not with violence, but with rhythm. They understand the assignment. They also understand the contradiction. In interviews before the tours, reporters ask the obvious questions. How can you represent a country that won't let you vote in some states? How can you play freedom when you don't fully have it? Armstrong smiles his famous smile, but there's iron underneath. I'll play anywhere, he says. Music don't care about color. Music just wants to be heard. Gillespie is more direct. They want me to show America to the world. Fine. I'll show them the real America, the one that swings. The first tours begin in 1956. Middle East, Southern Asia, Africa, Eastern Europe. The musicians board planes with their instruments and their doubts, heading to countries most Americans can't find on a map, carrying the weight of a nation's reputation in trumpet cases and drum bags. The itinerary is grueling. Multiple cities, multiple countries, constant travel. The musicians play in concert halls and outdoor stadiums, in universities and cultural centers. They play for diplomats and students, for workers and intellectuals, for anyone who will listen. And everyone listens. In Tehran, the hall is packed so tight that people stand in the aisles, pressed shoulder to shoulder. When Gillespie's band launches into A Night in Tunisia, the crowd goes wild. They've never heard anything like this. The complexity, the speed, the joyful chaos of bebop. The music doesn't just fill the room, it transforms it. In Karachi, students line up for hours to get tickets. They've heard recordings on scratchy radios, bootleg albums passed hand to hand. But live, jazz is a revelation. The improvisation, the way each musician takes a solo and makes it their own. The conversation between instruments, its democracy in musical form. Its freedom you can hear. In Belgrade, in Zagreb, in cities across Yugoslavia, the concerts become cultural events. Tito's government, threading the needle between East and West, welcomes the tours. The musicians play to standing room only crowds. Young people, hungry for connection to the world beyond their borders, absorb every note. The secret police take notes too. They write reports about attendance, about reactions, about the suspicious enthusiasm of Yugoslav youth. The KGB reads these reports carefully. This music is dangerous, they conclude, not because of what it says, but because of what it represents. Spontaneity, individual expression, freedom. Then comes Moscow. October 1956, the height of the Khrushchev thaw. Stalin is dead, denounced. The Soviet Union is cautiously opening to the world, but carefully, selectively, with suspicion embedded in every gesture. When Benny Goodman's band arrives in Moscow, the first major American jazz ensemble to tour the Soviet Union, the anticipation is electric. For years, Soviet citizens have listened to jazz on forbidden radio broadcasts, on smuggled recordings. They've been told it's decadent, dangerous, the sound of capitalist decay. But they've listened anyway, in secret, with the volume turned low. Now it's here, official, legal, sanctioned by the state. The concert hall fills early. Students, professors, engineers, artists they pour in, faces bright with anticipation. The government officials in the front rows look nervous. They've approved this, yes, but they're not sure what they've approved. They're not sure what will happen when the music starts. Goodman walks onto the stage. The crowd applauds politely, tentatively. Then the clarinet rises to his lips. The band counts off, and the music begins. For the first few bars, the audience sits frozen. This is not what they expected. It's wilder, freer, more joyful than anything the state radio plays. The rhythm is infectious. The solos are audacious. The music seems to laugh at authority, to mock the very idea of control. Then something breaks. A student in the back starts clapping along, then another, then an entire row. The rhythm spreads through the hall like a virus, like a revelation. By the time Goodman launches into Sing, 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 half the audience is on their feet, hands raised, bodies swaying. The government officials don't know what to do. Stop it. Let it continue. They chose poorly. They chose to let it continue. For 2 hours, American jazz occupies Soviet airspace. For 2 hours, the Iron Curtain might as well not exist. The musicians play with everything they have, pouring sweat and soul into every note. The audience responds with an enthusiasm that borders on hysteria. This isn't just music appreciation. This is awakening. This is the sound of another world, another way of being, crashing through decades of propaganda and control. When it's over, the applause lasts 10 minutes. Students rush the stage. They want autographs, handshakes, just to touch these musicians who've brought them something they didn't know they were missing. The secret police officers in the crowd file hurried reports. The CIA station chief in Moscow sends an urgent cable to Washington. Jazz is working. Back home, American officials read the reports with satisfaction. The music is doing exactly what they hoped. It's not converting Soviets to capitalism, not directly, but it's creating doubt. It's opening minds. It's proving that American culture, American creativity, American freedom can produce something undeniably beautiful. But the story is never that simple. Because while jazz is conquering hearts abroad, the musicians performing it are confronting an impossible contradiction. Louis Armstrong is preparing for a tour of Latin America when news breaks from Little Rock, Arkansas. September 1957. 9 black students try to integrate Central High School. The Arkansas governor calls out the National Guard to stop them. Eisenhower eventually sends federal troops to escort the students through mobs of screaming white protesters. The images flash around the world. Black children, dressed in their best clothes, walking through crowds of adults twisted with hate. This is American freedom. This is American democracy. This is what Armstrong is supposed to represent overseas. He cancels the tour. In an explosive interview, Armstrong calls President Eisenhower two-faced and says he has no interest in representing a country that treats its own citizens like this. The way they're treating my people in the South, he says, his famous smile nowhere to be seen. The government can go to hell. The State Department panics. Their most famous ambassador has gone rogue. But they also can't argue with him. Everything Armstrong said is true. The images from Little Rock are devastating American credibility far more effectively than any Soviet propaganda. Eventually, Armstrong returns to the tours, not because he's forgiven the government, but because he believes in the music. He believes in what it can do. But the contradiction haunts him. Haunts all of them. Duke Ellington navigates it differently. He's more diplomatic, more careful with his words, but his music speaks volumes. He composes Black, Brown, and Beige, a jazz symphony exploring African-American history. He plays it overseas, and audiences understand. This is not propaganda. This is truth told through melody. Dizzy Gillespie is characteristically direct. When asked about American racism during overseas interviews, he doesn't deflect. He acknowledges it. But he also talks about struggle, about progress, about the fight for justice. He makes it clear, representing America doesn't mean pretending it's perfect. It means showing that Americans can criticize their country and work to change it. This honesty, paradoxically, makes the tours more effective, because audiences abroad aren't stupid. They know about American racism. Soviet propaganda makes sure of that. But seeing these black artists speak openly about injustice while still creating transcendent art, that's powerful. That's complicated. That's real in a way propaganda never is. The Soviet response is predictable and panicked. State newspapers denounce jazz as barbaric noise, as capitalist corruption, as the soundtrack of imperialism. Officials warn citizens that jazz listening leads to moral decay, to Western decadence, to dangerous individualism. But the warnings fail because the music is already spreading. Bootleg recordings circulate in Moscow and Leningrad. University students form underground jazz clubs. Young musicians try to recreate the sounds they've heard, improvising in basement apartments with instruments cobbled together from whatever they can find. The Soviet government realizes they have a problem. They can't just suppress Western culture anymore, not completely. The thaw has opened doors that can't easily be closed. So they try a different approach. They create their own cultural offensive. The Bolshoi Ballet tours America. Soviet classical musicians perform in European capitals. The state promotes traditional Russian folk music, socialist realism in art, patriotic cinema. They want to prove that Soviet culture is superior, more refined, more serious, more meaningful than American commercialism. It's a mirror war, both sides deploying artists like chess pieces, both claiming to represent humanity's true values, both using culture to fight battles that can't be fought with weapons. The Bolshoi performances in America are magnificent. The dancers are world-class, the productions lavish. American audiences applaud enthusiastically. But something's different. The ballet is beautiful, but it's contained, perfect, but controlled. There's no improvisation, no spontaneity. Every movement is choreographed, every note planned. Jazz is the opposite. It's organized chaos, structured freedom. Every performance is different because the musicians are inventing it in real time, responding to each other and the audience and the moment. This is its power. This is why it's more than entertainment. It's a philosophy. It's a model for how society could work individuals, expressing themselves freely within a shared structure, creating something greater than any one person could produce alone. The tours continue through the late 50s and into the 60s. Dave Brubeck performs in Poland and India. Benny Goodman returns to the Soviet Union. Sarah Vaughan's voice carries American feeling to audiences in Venezuela and Brazil. The modern jazz quartet brings sophistication to Japan and Southeast Asia. The reports that filter back to Washington are extraordinary. A diplomat in Ankara writes about students who, after hearing a concert, changed their negative perceptions of America overnight. An embassy official in Lagos describes how a single performance did more for American-Nigerian relations than years of diplomatic meetings. The music creates moments of connection that transcend politics. A teenager in Warsaw hears Miles Davis and decides to learn trumpet. A factory worker in Moscow hears Ella Fitzgerald and understands that beauty can emerge from hardship. A student in Cairo hears Thelonious Monk and realizes that being different, being unique, being yourself, that's not just acceptable, it's essential. Numbers tell part of the story. Between 1956 and 1978, the Jazz Ambassadors program sends dozens of bands to over 100 countries. Millions of people attend concerts. Countless more listen on radio or hear recordings. The Voice of America broadcasts jazz around the world, reaching behind the Iron Curtain, into closed societies, into places where American diplomats can't travel. But numbers miss the deeper impact, the qualitative change, the way a young person's worldview shifts when they realize there's music like this, that art can be this free, that America flawed, hypocritical, contradictory. America can still produce something transcendent. Soviet officials understand the danger. KGB reports warn about the corrupting influence of jazz. One memo, later declassified, describes it as more dangerous than military propaganda, because it makes capitalism seem appealing without making any political arguments. They're right to worry, because jazz isn't arguing. It's not debating ideology or economic systems. It's doing something more fundamental. It's offering an experience of freedom. And once you've experienced that, even in music, it's hard to go back to accepting total control. The cultural Cold War reaches its strange zenith in the 60s. The Vietnam War makes America's image abroad more complicated. The civil rights movement forces Americans to confront their own contradictions more directly. Some musicians refuse to participate in what they see as government propaganda. Others continue, but on their own terms. They play jazz, yes, but they also speak honestly about American failures. They meet with local musicians, learn local music, create fusion and exchange that goes both ways. The tours stop being simple propaganda exercises and become something more complex, genuine cultural dialogue, with all the messiness that implies. In 1971, Duke Ellington tours the Soviet Union. He's older now, not far from the end of his life. But the music is still vital, still essential. In Moscow, he plays Take the A Train and watches Soviet faces light up with recognition. The song has been heard here, passed hand to hand on forbidden recordings. It's become part of the cultural underground. After the concert, young Soviet musicians crowd around him. They have questions about harmony, about improvisation, about freedom within structure. Ellington answers patiently, generously, but he's also asking them questions, learning about their music, their lives, their dreams. This is what the program has become at its best. Not a one-way broadcast of American superiority, but an exchange. Not propaganda, but conversation. Music as bridge, not weapon. The program officially ends in 1978, a victim of budget cuts and changing priorities. But its effects ripple outward, continuing long after the last official tour. The musicians who heard these concerts became teachers, influenced new generations. The recordings spread, were copied, were treasured. The idea that culture matters, that art can change minds, that a trumpet can be as powerful as a tank, that idea persisted. Looking back, it's tempting to see the Jazz Ambassadors program as cynical manipulation, the American government using black artists to cover its racial sins, musicians made into unwitting tools of propaganda. But the truth is more complicated. Yes, the State Department had strategic motives. Yes, they were trying to win the Cold War, but the musicians knew exactly what they were doing. They weren't dupes. They were navigating an impossible situation with as much dignity and honesty as they could manage. They chose to go because they believed in the music, because they understood that jazz represented something real about American possibility, even if America itself often failed to live up to that possibility, because they hoped that sharing their art might create connections, might change minds, might make the world slightly better. And it did. Not in simple ways, not by converting audiences to capitalism or democracy overnight, but by creating moments of beauty and freedom and connection that reminded people both in America and abroad of what's possible when human creativity is unleashed. The philosophy embedded in jazz turns out to be a powerful counter to authoritarianism, not because it argues against it explicitly, but because it embodies an alternative. Improvisation requires individual freedom within collective structure. It requires listening to others while expressing yourself. It requires rules, yes, but also the constant possibility of breaking those rules, of finding new ways, of making something that's never been made before. This is democracy in musical form, messy, unpredictable, often chaotic, but alive in a way that scripted performances can never be, vibrant in a way that state-controlled culture can never match. No leaflets, no weapons, just horns, just rhythm, just freedom. The Cold War is over now. The Soviet Union collapsed. The Iron Curtain lifted. Jazz won in its way, though it would be too simple to say that music alone defeated communism. History is never that tidy. But culture mattered. The slow drip of Western art and music and ideas did help erode the Soviet system from within, not through any single concert or broadcast, but through the accumulated effect of exposure to alternatives, to different ways of thinking and being and creating. The jazz ambassadors showed millions of people that American culture could be sophisticated, could be profound, could speak to universal human experiences of joy and sorrow and struggle. They complicated the Soviet narrative of America as purely materialistic and exploitative. They provided evidence that something genuine and beautiful could emerge from American soil. The program's legacy extends beyond the Cold War. It established cultural diplomacy as a legitimate tool of foreign policy. It proved that soft power, the power of attraction rather than coercion, could be as important as military might. It showed that artists, even artists from marginalized communities, could serve as effective ambassadors, maybe the most effective ambassadors, precisely because their authenticity couldn't be faked. Modern American cultural diplomacy, sending artists abroad, supporting international exchanges, broadcasting American music and film all traces back to those first jazz tours in the 1950s. The idea that a nation's culture is part of its strength, that art can open doors that politics cannot, that creativity and innovation are sources of national power. These ideas are now conventional wisdom, but they were radical once, proven effective by musicians with trumpets and saxophones and drums. The irony is inescapable. America's most effective Cold War weapon was created by its most oppressed citizens. The music that proved American freedom came from people denied full freedom. The art that represented American possibility was born from American injustice. But maybe that's not ironic. Maybe that's the point. Because jazz didn't emerge despite oppression. It emerged from oppression. It took suffering and transformed it into beauty. It took limitation and made it into innovation. It proved that even under the worst conditions, human creativity finds a way. If stories like this resonate with you, tales of how culture shaped history, how music became warfare, how artists changed the world, there's more to explore. Subscribe to join us as we uncover the hidden narratives that explain how we got here, the forgotten moments, the unlikely heroes, the secret weapons that weren't weapons at all. Because history isn't just about treaties and battles. It's about a trumpet in Moscow, a melody that crossed borders, a rhythm that outlasted empires. And there are so many more stories waiting to be told. This is the real message the jazz ambassadors carried. Not that America was perfect, but that Americans could create something perfect even while fighting for justice. Not that freedom was complete, but that the struggle for freedom could produce transcendent art. Not that all contradictions were resolved, but that art could hold contradictions, could acknowledge them, could transform them into something meaningful. When Louis Armstrong played his trumpet in Moscow, when Duke Ellington's orchestra swung through Warsaw, when Dizzy Gillespie bent the notes in Tehran, they weren't hiding American flaws. They were demonstrating American possibility. They were showing what could emerge when creativity was unleashed, when individual expression was valued, when people from any background could innovate and excel. The Soviet audience members who crowded those concert halls, who risked official disapproval to listen to forbidden music, understood this instinctively. They weren't being converted to capitalism. They were experiencing something deeper, the power of art to transcend politics, the ability of music to speak truths that ideology cannot, the way rhythm and melody can create connections across every divide. Some of those audience members are still alive. In interviews, they describe those concerts as life-changing moments. The night they realized there was more to the world than what their government told them. The evening that opened their minds to possibilities beyond their borders. The performance that made them believe change was possible. This is how culture wins wars. Not through coercion or argument, but through demonstration. Not by telling people what to think, but by giving them an experience that changes how they think. Not through propaganda, but through art so genuine it cannot be denied. The musicians who served as jazz ambassadors are mostly gone now. Armstrong died in 1971, Ellington in 1974, Gillespie in 1993, Goodman in 1986. The generation that proved jazz could change the world has passed into history, but the recordings remain. The music persists. The idea that culture matters, that art can be powerful, that a melody can carry meanings. No speech can express that idea lives on. In embassies around the world, cultural affairs officers still send American artists abroad, hip-hop musicians to Brazil, rock bands to Southeast Asia, classical ensembles to the Middle East. The programs have different names now, different structures, but the fundamental insight remains the same. America's most effective ambassadors are often its artists. The lesson of the jazz ambassadors extends beyond music, beyond Cold War history. It speaks to something essential about power and influence in the modern world. Military might matters, certainly. Economic strength is crucial, but the ability to inspire, to attract, to make people want to engage with your culture and the values, that the kind of power that endures. Hard power can force compliance. Soft power creates genuine connection. And in a world where information flows freely, where people can choose what to listen to and watch and believe, soft power might be the most important power of all. The trumpet that echoed through Moscow in 1956 carried all of this, not explicitly, not as argument or propaganda, just as music, just as rhythm and melody and improvisation and soul. The Soviet officials who approved that concert thought they were taking a calculated risk, a small gesture toward openness that would demonstrate Soviet cultural confidence. They didn't realize they were inviting revolution, not the violent kind, the subtle kind, the kind that happens in hearts and minds, that spreads through underground clubs and bootleg recordings, that teaches people to hear freedom and want more of it. By the time they understood what they'd done, it was too late. The music was out. The sound had spread. The rhythm had taken hold. Freedom, it turns out, is infectious, not the abstract political kind that can be debated and deconstructed. The experiential kind, the kind you feel in your bones when the rhythm hits just right, the kind that makes your body move despite yourself, that makes your heart soar, that reminds you what it means to be fully completely, impossibly alive. This is what the jazz ambassadors carried in their instrument cases, not just American music, but the embodied experience of American ideals at their best. Not perfect, never perfect, but striving, always striving, creating beauty from struggle, forging art from adversity, turning pain into transcendence. The Cold War is history now, but the struggle between freedom and control continues in new forms, new contexts. The tension between individual expression and collective order plays out differently but persists. The question of what a society values, what it permits, what it celebrates, that question never goes away. And music still matters, art still matters, culture still matters, because human beings need more than food and shelter and safety. We need meaning, we need beauty, we need connection, we need to feel that our lives are part of something larger, something worthwhile, something that acknowledges our individuality while connecting us to others. Jazz offered all of this, continues to offer it. The improvisational conversation between musicians, the way each player gets their solo, but must listen to and respond to the ensemble, the balance between freedom and structure. It remains a powerful model for how society could work, how humans could relate to each other, how we might honor both the individual and the collective. The jazz ambassadors didn't win the Cold War alone. History is never that simple, but they fought in that war as effectively as any general, as courageously as any soldier. They carried American culture into hostile territory and made people listen. They took art born from oppression and used it to demonstrate possibility. They proved that soft power could be as consequential as hard power, that culture could change minds that weapons could never reach. Long after the Cold War ended, the echoes of that trumpet still carry, reminding the world that sometimes the loudest message of power is a song.